Parimal Joshi. I am working as an associate director with a company called CRISIL. CRISIL is a CRISIL Risk Infrastructure Solutions, a Standards and Poor's company, and we are working in the urban development sector. And a primary focus has been on the urban water supply and sanitation. And I've been listening to the discussions that have happened thus far, and I can say that or note that the points that I'm going to discuss are more from the governance perspective. The discussions have been thus far focused on the investments and how the investments could be sort of brought in water and the sanitation sector. But I think what needs to be done, or rather simultaneously kept in mind or focused, is to look at the governance perspective, because while we are here to discuss governance and investments, I think governance is slightly somehow not discussed to the extent possible or to the extent necessary. So what I'm trying to do is explain, or rather, if I were to sort of explain or describe what is the status of water supply and sanitation services, and I'm sort of contouring myself to urban water supply and sanitation systems, particularly which are dealt by municipalities and the parastatal agencies of the state governments. And the three-word description would be low investment, low service levels, low cost recovery, and it's a vicious cycle that most of the urban water supply utilities are trapped in. And a lot of discussion has already gone into how investments are necessary to improve this, but I think there is a disconnect in the sense that the governance aspect of improving service delivery is somehow misconstrued with the need for investment or need for larger investment. You should imagine it's like a bucket with multiple holes, and you try to invest, you try to pump money. The ultimate outcome is not so successful or efficient utilities that you see often. So I'm going to restrict my description to 4 broad points. One is just to establish what is the governance structure that I'm talking about. There are different models that exist in India, because India is a very broad, large and huge country with diverse setups, settings, both political, geographic. So what are the different models that have been adopted? What are the key constraints or other bottlenecks that emanate out of all of these models that exist? And then how the governance and the institutional arrangements have an impact on the investments and private sector participation. What is necessary to sort of leapfrog? So there have been investments, private sector participation in water and sanitation for quite some time. But I think the leapfrog has not happened, the scale-up has not happened, and there are various reasons for that. And my intention would be to focus on the reasons which are pertaining to institutional and governance related. And at the end, I would just like to sort of bring out my points on what needs to be done or what needs to be kept in mind, or some pointers for sort of thinking for the future. And I'll end after that. So basically, water. This is slightly theoretical, but just bear with me for a couple of seconds. Water is a state subject in India. While the 74th Constitutional Amendment says that the urban local bodies, the last tier of the government, is supposed to perform the water and sanitation services, but it is not mandatory. So the states still continue to have a pervasive sort of interest in delivering water supply services. So while there is a lot of discussion on private sector participation, private investment, typically in India, water utilities are managed by government, though there is some progress in private sector participation, but one would say that it is still at a nascent stage. given the complexities, the diversities that are existing in the country. The other critical point that needs a mention here that there is for private sector investment, and particularly for PPPs, the utilities and the projects need to have commercial orientation, and the objective has to be to improve the service levels and not to just create a project which is bankable enough but is not of commercial orientation, which means the utility which is undertaking that project is not geared or prepared to sort of tackle the complexities that come along with the commercial perspective with respect to utility service delivery. And this is particularly difficult in India because the pricing, which is a critical aspect of private sector investment, I would say pivotal element of creating enabling environment for private sector investment in water sector, is a very political issue and is a subject of, I would say, discussions and debates, and it's a very complex, as Mr. Garg also pointed it out. Water is even complex domain to delve in detail. The objective or other perspective has been that improving service delivery of water supply systems or water supply utilities is perceived or rather is looked at as if it is an external sort of push, and there is no internal willingness or rather urge to improve, or rather there are no incentives for utilities to make an internal improvement. And when I say make an internal improvement, so a typical water supply service, you will not get water supply. Not all people will have access to water supply. The quality of water may not be up to the standards. The hours of supply may be erratic. So in general, the service levels, which are defined as service level benchmarks, they are not typically up to the standards or up to the mark in most of the urban water supply utilities in India. And there is an external push always, which is maybe in terms of creating national programs like you have. I'm not saying that investments are not necessary, but the improvements in the institutional and governance structures or the arrangements have to go hand in hand with the investments that are being planned. And the focus has always been on, or rather inclined in creating investments, creating assets, without having a proper sort of understanding of the capacity of those utilities to be able to bear with those costs and the subsequent complexities that will arise out of these investments. I mean, the O&M is something which needs to be kept in mind. So here the cities do not have sufficient revenues to sort of pay salary checks. And on top of that, there is a grant that is given for capital infrastructure. The city then needs to think about how it is going to ring fence the O&M cost that is going to arise once that particular, say for example, a water treatment plant gets developed. And then the city then has to sort of organize for resources which will pay for its operation and maintenance. And the sustainability of the water sector then typically depends on the ability of the utilities to manage those resources. And more often than not, we have seen it's a disaster if these things are not kept in mind or planned properly. So the point here on this slide is to emphasize that investments are happening, have happened in the past, but the service levels that have come out as an outcome of these investments are not so encouraging. I'm not saying that there is nothing that has happened. Improvements have definitely happened, but I think as I just said earlier, the investments synchronization between the investments and the improvement in the governance structure and the institutional arrangements or the institutions themselves is very, very critical, and that is somehow is getting sort of side sidestepped, and I think this is just a summary of some cities where you see the service levels. None of these cities are able to sort of meet the service level standards or service level benchmark that are prescribed by the Government of India on any of the parameters. The second point that is important to note here is that the quality of the information. I think for you to improve, you first need to understand that there is some problem, and for you to understand that there is a problem, you need to measure or monitor this. And the data systems that exist in the utilities, they don't really are aligned with this perspective of performance measurement. So the service level benchmarking initiative that was started was a right step in that direction, that you first need to understand where you are, and then that will help you to structure your projects, and then projects which have an impact on the service levels are the ones that you need to take up. And that's how the typical planning process has to follow. But somehow the sequencing of activities of investments and improvements and reforms are sort of not so synchronized. And that is, I think, is a part of the problem that we still are seeing in utilities. The service levels are still not up to the international standards. And so the four models that I was just referring to of the governance structure in India, that so for example, there are states where urban local bodies tend to provide the water supply services. There are state governments which provide water supply services through city level parastatal agencies. Plus there are states which are having public health engineering departments as a service provider. And there is a hybrid model. So here what is happening is the function of water supply delivery is not performed end-to-end by one single agency. There are, for capital investment, you have different agencies. For O&M, you have different agencies. Although there are cities in India, particularly in Maharashtra, Gujarat, where cities are responsible for end-to-end service delivery, right from creating dams for themselves for water resource to the end-user connection. But there are states in India where the assets are created by one agency, and I beg my pardon, and the operation and maintenance is done by some other agency. So so there is a mismatch and misalignment of functions, and there is overlap of functions, and sometimes this creates confusion, and this confusion then affects the service level and service delivery of the utility. So so peculiar problems that are cutting across all these types of models or all these types of structure, governance structure that exist. As I said, there is no single utility that is responsible for end-to-end service delivery. For example, what happens in case of say UP, you have a state level agency which prepares for capital investment, prepares the DPR, and then the city has to then take care of its operation and maintenance. Then what happens if the DPR there is some fault, some issue in design? It is the responsibility of the city government to deal with that. So what is happening is that since there is no single agency, the accountability of service delivery is not getting assigned to proper institution. So that sort of brings to the second point where the agency which is doing everything is in fact doing a conflicting function. For example, a PHED is doing planning, designing, policy, tariffs, everything, regulation. So there is no segregation of functions which need to be independent, and there is agency which is doing everything. So which again not a principle that a good governance policy follows. Then the financing, as I said, availability of financing has not always resulted in improvement in service levels. The accountability again to the internal stakeholders, that is within the department, is missing. There are no mechanisms in place for staff to be held accountable for non-performance. Then there are external accountability mechanisms, although they are present, but they are not strong enough to be able to. So, for example, if say there is Bangalore Water Supply Board, it is a state level parastatal, but for the city level, there is no political representation in that body, and the state assigns or state nominates the board of directors. So what is happening is that the water, which is actually the service that is required for the citizens, there is no local political representation in that body. So what is happening is that the external accountability to the citizens is very limited. Although BWSSB is performing well because of other reasons, but there are such principles which are not followed, and which result into weak accountability. And when there is weak accountability, you can imagine the status where we are right now is a compilation, or rather it's a combination of weak accountability and autonomy related issues. So accountability has to follow with autonomy. Most of the cities in India do not have functional autonomy. So when I say functional autonomy, I'm referring to they don't have power to set tariffs. They don't have powers to recruit. They don't have powers to go to the market and do commercial borrowing. So which is what, so you are given a function, a responsibility, but the corresponding power that is necessary, or the autonomy or the authority that is necessary, is not passed on. And the expectation is that the utility or the agency has to perform. It's a perfect recipe for a disaster, and which is what we are heading, and which is what we have continued to follow. The last but the important point here is that the utilities are failure, or rather are not performing more predominantly because of lack of capacity, both in terms of the skill sets and the numbers. And this is common across all the types of utilities, all the models of utilities that exist in India. And this point does get addressed in various national missions, but the real sense in which this needs to be addressed is still evasive, I would say. And so just to summarize, these are the issues which are sort of creating bottlenecks for private sector investments. And while there are investors willing to put in money, but the readiness of utilities and the institutions who are the executing agencies is a very critical and must to have, I think, before any project gets sort of at least conceptualized and structured, and it proceeds. So I think the missing bits, there are a lot of PPP projects that have happened, that have been conceived, but could not see the light of the day because of various reasons with respect to this. So what I want to do is propose a framework, and these are some of the points that one should ponder upon, and sort of it's a sort of a thought that what a successful or good utility should have or should look like in terms of its governance and institutional arrangement. So there are 4 key pillars, I would say, that are key to the success of utility. I'm not saying there are no other, but these are the important ones. You cannot look at investments and these principles in isolation. Investments are still necessary, but I think from the governance perspective, what needs to be done is a transparency, accountability, autonomy, and sustainable financing. So the first 3 I've already spoken about, but the sustainable financing is something which is critical again, and it sort of circles back to the earlier statement that I made. If I describe the current situation of water sector or water utilities in India, it is low investments, low service level, and low cost recovery. So it's a vicious cycle, and sustainable financing is something which is critical. Ability to pay will vary. State governments and the central governments will have to finance the utilities, but the mechanism or the incentives or the frameworks for the cities to at least recover their operation and maintenance costs is something that the focus should be on. And these subsidies in the form of tariffs and the user charges that are applied, they are in most cases misdirected, and there is a significant need for utilities to focus on preparing a rational utility or user charges or user fees or tariff structures going forward, because if investments are necessary, the intrinsic reforms including the financial sustainability and the setting of tariffs and sort of increasing the cost recovery are going to be critical for creating a bankable and successful PPP projects going forward. So I think I've taken more than what I was given. So I'll just conclude or rather summarize the discussion or the points that I just raised. The type of governance model does not ensure any guarantee. So the key principles that I've just said, transparency, accountability, autonomy, and financial sustainability. These are the 4 pillars of a successful utility, and that needs to be followed. While there are programs that are focused on investments, there needs to be a program that also simultaneously focuses on how these governance principles or ideas get ingrained, and it's a very long process and complex one, I would say. Then second point, cities will depend on the state and central government for capital financing. Budgetary support will be necessary at least for the foreseeable future, but the incentive for the cities to at least recover O&M costs should be the focus. And only the well-structured projects need to be sort of, so whatever gets accepted, the cities are going to present the same rubbish to you. So the state and central government need to be more responsible and careful when they structure or rather approve a project which is sort of not structured properly. The thirdly, as Garg sir was mentioning, there is no regulation or independent regulation of the sector. So the regulatory functions are also performed by the same utilities or their principals or their agents. So basically, regulation is something which is an independent function that needs to be done independently. And at the moment, I don't see any framework available, at least for the water sector in India, which takes care of regulatory aspects of the system. The capacity building is also a critical aspect, since cities, many of the cities are responsible for water supply services. The water supply and sanitation departments are not ring-fenced. So there is no way in which you can identify whether they are performing good or bad, because budgets, staff, nothing is ring-fenced. So there is no institutional memory that is available for the new people or for the sector to, or for the department to further proceed and improve upon their service delivery. So I think keeping those points in mind is very, very critical. Last and not the least, private sector participation is necessary to supplement in improving service delivery. But however, that's not the only solution that is available. I think that's it. With that, I will end this, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to present my thoughts on the subject.